Have you ever wondered why the Japanese occupation of the Philippines was so short compared to that of the Spaniards? And why, until today, we are so dependent on the United States? Well, pag-usapan natin yan in today's episode of Kape't Kasaysayan, where we go through history together with our cups of coffee. I am Gail.
I am Lance.
And I'm Toni, and we will be your host for today. So today's episode, we'll discuss chapters 5 to 7 of A Continuing Past by Constantino. Specifically, we will talk about the collaboration and resistance during the Japanese occupation and how it was an opportunity lost for the Filipinos. We will also discuss the politics involved in our so-called liberation of the Americans.
With that, get your caffeine fix and follow us as we journey through a period of politics, betrayal, and power.
In 1939, World War II began, and not less than 2 years later, the Philippines changed from being a colony of Uncle Sam to a colony of the rising sun, with the Japanese believing that they have liberated the Philippines from Western ideals and notions. The Japanese, however, had difficulties in exercising their control. Bakit? Two words that we should take note of: collaboration and resistance. So, collaboration. To colonize the Philippines faster and easier, the Japanese left the job of leadership to the same set of people who led during the American colonization, whom the Filipinos already look up to. In this way, they hope to gain the trust and support of many since karamihan pa nga ay loyal to the Commonwealth. Majority of Quezon's cabinet accepted hence collaboration since ang belief din nila ay the best government has to come from their ranks. There are two different reasons, however, as to why these politicians collaborated. So first is that they were really pro-Japanese. Artemio Ricarte, for example, was a Philippine Revolution general who was in exile in Japan. He accepted because he wants to continue the fight against the US, who robbed us of our freedom he fought a revolution for. Other pro-Japanese also believed that they would grow in prestige under their reign. Second is that they collaborated kasi they were pro-Americans na naniniwala na the US would come back to save them. So parang sa isip nila, they were just holding the fort until help arrived. Quezon and MacArthur's instruction to play neutral and to do anything they say except pledge allegiance to Japan also played a factor. From here pa lang, no, ramdam na natin agad yung downfall ng government natin. At first, mabuti pa yung intentions sa mga politicians, but as time went on, the original motivation was lost and instead, they used the instructions of Quezon and MacArthur as a shield to protect them from backlash against the public. So they justified their collaboration as them, one, following Quezon's instructions, two, staying loyal to the US by giving aid to some guerrilla groups, and three, protecting the Philippines by avoiding unnecessary bloodshed by choosing to submit to the Japanese. And furthermore, noong January 42, the Japanese announced that they were intending to grant independence to the Philippines. With this, the collaborating politicians had another justification, which is number 4, that they were helping the Filipinos achieve their long-time goal. The politicians responded back to the Japanese that they were ready to obey and help. Ultimately, their justifications were rooted in patriotism and responsibility for the Filipino, so self-sacrifice daw kumbaga. Pero unfortunately, they mainly collaborated kasi they wanted to protect their families and not their countrymen. Mapapaisip ka na lang talaga kung may nationalism pa ba yung mga Filipino by that time. So aside from using the Quezon government leaders to further solidify the Japanese hold, Jose P. Laurel was chosen to be the president of the puppet government. So originally, there was talk of making George Vargas the president with his knowledge of bureaucracy and skills in administration. In fact, he was nicknamed Little President kasi he handled a lot of affairs during President Quezon's reign as his secretary. He was also the one tasked by Quezon to speak to the Japanese forces, and that slowly led him from being pro-American to being pro-Japanese, with him even defending the laws of Japan and critiquing the many Western influences on the Philippines. Unfortunately, that was also the reason why that made him unworthy to be president. The Japanese needed someone who was not known as a supporter of theirs to continue the illusion that independence was given to the Filipinos. With Manuel Rojas being unwilling and Ramon Avicenna being too old, the final choice was Laurel. He was the best candidate kasi he is a known nationalist. May independence siya na hinahanap ng Japanese. And he also has a background of working in the judiciary, legislative, and executive branches of the government. He's also a lawyer and made friendships with many Japanese already. He accepted the position kasi he believed that the Filipinos lacked discipline, centralized control, and national purpose. And thus, he planned to reform the Philippine society to mirror the values of the Japanese, as their culture apparently shows our supposed lacking traits. Ayun nga lang, his ambition will not come to light kasi nga natalo ang Axis powers, making his presidency one of the shortest. Masasabi natin na Laurel really had good nationalist intentions. Yung vision niya for society are very nice. However, they have very authoritarian overtones. Walang people's participation sa mga plano niya, and instead, it's only a government ruled by a powerful president, so akin to a Japanese emperor. So since we have discussed the collaboration, let us now move on to the resistance. Before the Japanese occupation, the Philippines had the USAFE, or the United States Army Forces in the Far East, that had General MacArthur as its commander and was comprised of both American and Filipino soldiers. So after the call to retreat to Bataan was given due to the arrival of the imperial forces, some of these men were unable to leave. To uphold their duty, they created resistance groups, or also known as guerrilla groups, with other people who wanted to liberate the country from the Japanese army. So there were a lot of guerrilla groups, some large, some small. So there are ones in Central Luzon, Manila, Bulacan, and even Visayas and Mindanao. So these groups will be discussed in the next chapter. So on to you, Tony.
We have talked about how the politicians and government functioned during the Japanese occupation. Now, let's have a more detailed discussion of the resistance groups with Chapter 6, The Resistance Opportunities Lost. To start, most were created by USFM members that did not retreat to Bataan and had the same system as the military with different ranks to award their people in. Just a reminder though, ang mga resistance groups na ito ay di ginawa para maging malaya na tayo sa mga Hapon at Amerikano, kundi para may mga kakampi si MacArthur kapag bumalik siya. Parang masyadong hinahanga siya as hero, no? To the point, the first thing this resistance group did was to contact the American forces and MacArthur stationed in Australia, showing how very dependent we were to them. Medyo kalat pa nga sila nung time na yon, pero once a connection pushed through, this helped them regroup, especially to follow the orders of MacArthur, which was just to recruit members, send intel, and stay under the radar of the imperial forces. From then, military supplies were sent to the Philippines, with Courtney Whitney, an old friend of MacArthur and an intelligence officer, coordinating the distributions between groups. It is notable to say that these supplies had this infamous parting words, "I shall return" label on them. The general had some anxieties that the Filipinos have started to believe the Japanese, so he did this to keep them hopefully waiting for his heroic return. Some very hardcore propaganda right there. Of course, may mga pasaway din that did not just sit still, because what's the point of having a resistance group if there's no fighting? An example is Adevoso, who led an ambush against 200 Japanese soldiers. Everyone else, though, just followed the order, with some staying in centers or working in the government just bidding their time away. Most units were made up of people that had very different motivation, such as revenge or maybe just to kill time. But despite the difference, they considered themselves to be heroes or patriots of their country once they joined. With such a large number of people joining, though, it is inevitable that there will be fights among themselves and between other groups. At times, it was bloody, due to power struggles such as group fightings on who should be head, or due to difference in morality, like the hunters versus markings. These two groups functioned in roughly the same area, hence why they tried to one-up each other a lot of times. Each group was suspicious of each other and always accused the other when something was wrong. Even civilians were affected by their fighting, since favoring one side will cause bad blood with the opposing. Their petty battles caused so many deaths on both sides and only stopped when Colonel Bernard Anderson interfered and reminded them of their duty to prepare for when the US Army arrived. It is sad to note that the people who joined the groups believe they are doing such a big patriotic duty, they should be treated like kings with 5-star service when visiting towns or villages. But of course, it was very hard to do so when everyone was struggling to survive. And with materials being scarce, it was very hard to share. This led to exploitive and abusive acts done by the members. Instead of focusing on fighting the enemy, they turn on their own allies and civilians. There is one resistance group, however, that was very different from the rest. Ang tunay na grupo na lumalaban para sa Pilipinas. Sila ang Hukbalahap. The group's ideology had a more communistic approach, which was very different from the American-based ideals of most resistance groups, and why they were also hated by them. Its members were fighting long before the Japanese came, having been used to the military struggle from their old membership as the Socialist Party, Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or the Radical Worker Unions. They already predicted the possibility of having a guerrilla war with the Japanese, hence why they wrote to President Quezon saying that they are loyal to the US and the Commonwealth and will liberate the Philippines using guerrilla tactics. Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, also known as Hukbalahap or Hooks, was made on March 29, 1942 and consisted of PKP leaders, Canadian men, and various other people from parts of the Philippines. They aimed to spark hope into the Filipino people to fight for their motherland. They had principles that every person must follow, which can be read in the Iron Discipline and the Fundamental Spirit. They must defend civilians from the attack of the enemies and must always be respectful to them. They even created the BUDC, also known as the Barrio United Defense Corps, that was an underground group that helps in defense against thieves. The members were even officials of these villages and led trials, as well as sent intel to the Hooks. They also taught people on various topics, ranging from politics to science, due to members being teachers or writers, to encourage bond between the unit and the people. They also raised morale in the troops and people via leaflets and their publication called Katubusan ng Bayan. These acts led to them earning the trust of the people, hence why they also protect the Hooks from being discovered. Very different from the system of the other USFA groups. As much as they tried to implement such acts, may iba din na hindi sumusunod. Fights, thievery, and corruption still happened within the group. Some systems in the group could no longer be applied as it got bigger, such as the application process, since it was very relaxed and anyone can join, which led to some internal problems in the future. The Hooks were not welcomed by the US. Even if they wanted to collaborate with the other resistance groups, they were turned down because of the difference in motivation and just overall hate for what they stand for. The Hooks, despite fighting the Japanese, even raising both the American and Philippine flag in victory, were shunned due to the many pro-Americans that believe that liberation will not be possible without the support of the US. This just goes to show that these resistance forces against the Japanese were generally made to support the American forces' return, showing that maybe real liberation was not in the mind of people, but instead they helped prepare for the second American occupation with the return of our most awaited general.
I shall return, and I did. Now that we are done with the Japanese colonization, let's move on naman to Chapter 7, The Politics of Liberation, for the most awaited return of the one and only MacArthur. It was October of 1944 nung finally nakarating na si MacArthur sa Leyte. He publicly announced his glorious arrival and his plans to revive the Commonwealth government. This was very momentous kasi it was like his way of saying na, I'm back, you're in good hands now, Philippines. Everything is going to be all right. And how did the Filipinos react to this? Well, 3 years of Japanese colonization did not produce anti-colonial consciousness. For the Filipinos during this time, the definition of liberty was the reoccupation of the Americans. Kaya enthusiastic sila sa pag-welcome sa kanilang idol and savior na si MacArthur. Because of this, the Americans didn't have a hard time in reimposing their authority. In this chapter, we will be talking a lot about MacArthur kasi he was the driving force that shaped the post-war political landscape of the Philippines. Oftentimes, he made big decisions by himself at hindi siya nakinig sa orders ng kanyang higher-ups sa US kasi he believed that he was in the best position to formulate a pro-American neo-colony out of the Philippines. With the economy in ruins after the war, MacArthur believed that the only way to restore the country was by replicating the democratic orientation of the pre-war government. Gusto niyang ipabalik yung old political elite kasi napatunayan na nila yung colonial reliability nila. This preference for pro-American elites became MacArthur's strategy in political realignment. Now let's take a look at how MacArthur directed and controlled guerrilla units in the country. Firstly, through an indirect method, which is inspiring opportunism among the elite guerrilla leaders. When the word about the American troops is landing spread in the Philippines, guerrilla leaders became more politically ambitious. Gusto nila na impress sa mga Americans by showing na marami silang nagawa during the war, in hopes that they would be promoted into government positions as a reward. So many guerrilla leaders were obsessed with this dream to the point that they mass enrolled random people with the promise of future back pay. An example of this was the Zambales military district under Ramon Magsaysay, where they invited anyone who claimed to have contributed in the resistance, even if wala namang proof or hindi totoo. Di bale na kay Magsaysay kung yung back pay lang yung habol ng new recruits. Yung practice na to actually reinforced mercenary attitudes at sinira nito yung prestige ng madaming guerrilla units. Next, let's move on naman to a more direct and straightforward case of MacArthur's manipulation of guerrilla units with the Huk Balahap versus Yusafe sa Central Luzon. From the Japanese occupation, alam nating may pre-existing tension na ang Huks with the Yusafe kasi una, iba yung composition ng administrasyon nila. Peasants yung leaders ng Huks, while elitists naman yung leaders sa Yusafe. Pangalawa, magkaiba yung ideologies nila. Habang pinaglalaban ng mga Huks yung equality ng socialism, gusto naman ng Yusafe na ma-maintain yung social hierarchy at hacienda system. Pangatlo, napadalas yung territorial disputes nila at tinatawagan pa nga ng mga Huks na tulisafe ang mga Yusafe. It's important to note rin na walang direct communication ang Huks kay MacArthur in contrast sa Yusafe. So with all these differences, it's not surprising na mas close si MacArthur sa Yusafe. Every time nag-clash ang Yusafe at Huks, sinusumbong niya nila kay MacArthur, kaya in the end, overwhelmingly, mataas yung accusations held against the Huks. Even though pareho naman sana silang pro-American at anti-Japanese. So sinira ng Yusafe ang image ng Huks by claiming na anti-American sila and yung barrio organizations nila ay copies ng Soviet models. To clarify misconceptions, nag-release ng statement entitled Where We Stand si Huk Balahap Commander Mariano Balgos para ma-defend yung side nila. Sa statement na yun, in-explain niya na sinusuportahan ng Huks ang Commonwealth at nire-respeto nilang demokrasya. Even if wala silang regular communication with MacArthur throughout the war, hindi nawala yung loyalty nila to the US, kaya they fought alongside the Americans in driving out the last of the Japanese troops in Manila and Pampanga. But despite all this, nauwi lang sa wala yung efforts ng Huks. Sa perspective kasi ni MacArthur, yung ideologies at high level of military organization nila ay nag-threaten sa kanyang colonial goals. He was afraid that if the organization grew, they would spark real anti-colonial consciousness and establish communism in the Philippines. So long before he even landed in the country, nagplano na si MacArthur ng anti-Huk drive. Nung binisita ng US Army ang Central Luzon noong February 1945, hindi nila ni-recognize yung Huk Balahap as a legit guerrilla organization. Pinatanggal nila lahat ng Huk officials sa Nueva Ecija, Tarlac, Bulacan, Pampanga, at Leyte at pinalitan ang mga to with Yusafe members. This discrimination led the Huks to be considered as civilians and they were forced to surrender all their arms and disband. And the Huks faced a dilemma dito. If they surrendered their arms, they would be at the mercy of their Yusafe enemies. Pero if they refused naman, they would be regarded as bandits. Apparently, meron palang nakarating na kay MacArthur na balita na ninakaw daw ng Huks yung armas ng Yusafe units, kaya they were charged for treason, robbery, murder, and arson. In the end, more than 100 Huks surrendered or were captured, including Luis Tarok and Castro Alejandrino. They were sent to jail and were tortured until they died. What befell the Huks was really a tragic story of betrayal. MacArthur's aggressive anti-Huk policies paralyzed their organization. Nung narinig na ng ibang Huks na pinakulong at tinorture yung mga kasama nila, most of them retreated to their barrios, and that was the bitter ending for the Huks. Ngayon, tungo naman tayo sa government realignment. During this period in 1945, the Commonwealth admin was nearing its end. In 1946, a new government, independent of American influence, would be established. Kaya big deal talaga yung election season dito. Originally, there was only one running party, and this was the Nacionalista Party, which composed of Sergio Osmeña as president and Manuel Rojas as VP. Along the way, nagkaroon ng tension sa dalawa kasi iba yung views nila on collaboration. Osmeña was anti-collaboration, while Rojas was more forgiving for collaborations committed under duress. Rojas was speaking for himself kasi accused of collaboration noong 1944 when na-coerce siyang maging chairman ng planning board ni Laurel pero bigyan siya ng pardon ni MacArthur. Di ba na-establish na natin na pinifavor ni MacArthur ang old political elite in selecting officials? Well, between the two, MacArthur greatly preferred Rojas as president kasi malaki yung tiwala niya sa democratic orientation ni Rojas. The fact that Quezon, the previous Commonwealth president, also favored Rojas as his successor over Osmeña made MacArthur feel that his instincts were reasonable. Rojas is a proud product of the American public school system. You can just imagine kung gaano kalalim ang indoctrination na tanggap niya tungkol sa importance ng American influence. Para sa kanya, he was serving MacArthur, kundi pati na rin yung American friends ni MacArthur. Na-witness ni MacArthur kung paano naging reliable si Rojas as an army officer and public official before and throughout the Japanese occupation. And so he believed na with Rojas as president, ma-maintain yung favorable colonial relationship ng America and Philippines. On the other hand, MacArthur made it clear na ayaw niya si Osmeña. In the first place, may bad blood si MacArthur at Osmeña kasi hindi sila nagkasundo sa Philippine defense plan back in the war. Also, kakampi rin ni Osmeña si Harold Iquez, yung political advisor ng arch nemesis ni MacArthur. MacArthur viewed all these things as red flags, kaya he constantly put Osmeña under difficult positions. Alam naman natin na nung pagbalik ni MacArthur sa Pilipinas, he acted as an autocrat. With the help of the U.S. Army, he provided communication and transport services. He pacified the guerrilla units and reorganized local governments. He was the supreme judge on all collaboration cases in the country, in which he practically granted amnesty to nearly all those who were charged, since they were part of his pre-war business circle. Also, he spearheaded the relief operations and construction of public works projects with the help of the Philippine Civil Affairs Unit or PCAU. So the Philippines was highly dependent on the Americans during this time. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth staff under Osmeña barely had any funds and resources to actively participate in these operations. Osmeña was put in an awkward position where he did not have the power to do anything because MacArthur wouldn't give him the authority to control U.S. troops. So because of this, the Filipinos gave their gratitude to MacArthur instead of Osmeña. With the bad impression that Osmeña was getting and the divided opinion on collaboration, nag-split ang Nationalista Party into two factions. Osmeña and the anti-collaboration supporters stayed in the NP, while Rojas and other elite collaborators formed the Liberal Party. The LP became widely popular among the public kasi si Rojas yung ini-endorse ni MacArthur. Siyempre, having MacArthur and Rojas aside is such a huge plus for the LP kasi that means binaback up rin sila ng elite friends ni MacArthur. Particularly sina Andres Soriano, Jacobo Zobel, Tomas Morato at Joaquin Elizalde ay nag-contribute rin sa Rojas campaign by sponsoring pro-Rojas newspapers like the Daily News and Balita. In a desperate attempt to gather more supporters, nag-form ng coalition si Osmeña with the Democratic Alliance, which was an anti-collaboration group formed by the Hukbalahap, the Pambansang Kaisahan ng Magbubukid, the Committee on Labor Organization, and other peasant unions who opposed Rojas. Ang resulta ng NPDA coalition na to ay ang alteration ng original programs ni Osmeña, since the DA also had their fair share of the tax. The DA further opposed collaboration and proposed heavier punishments. Moreover, the DA demanded modest working conditions and wages. Although maganda naman sana yung labor demands ng DA, hindi ito nagustuhan ng pre-war oligarchy. Maraming landlords na kaibigan ng Osmeña ay nag-turn away sa kanya kasi natatakot sila sa communism undertones ng programs niya. Despite all these losses, Osmeña and his forces held on to the argument that if Rojas became president, the Philippines would not receive any U.S. aid for its rehabilitation kasi the Americans would never help a collaborator. Lo and behold, dumating si High Commissioner Paul MacNaught para i-demolish tong argument by formally announcing that the U.S. would help the Philippines regardless of whom is chosen as president. This became the biggest blow for Osmeña because his connection with the DA made him an unsuitable ally. In-expose ito yung kanyang lack of vigor, indecisiveness, at weak leadership. So ultimately, in the 1945 elections, Rojas won by a margin of 203,000 votes and became the first president of the Republic of the Philippines. With that, the vision of MacArthur was turned to reality. American imperialism in the Philippines was once more secured with the restoration of the native elites and the American guerrilla reserves. And that was the end for chapter 7. Wow, that was quite a lot to take in, no?
Oo, like, 4 years lang yung whole timeline from the start of the Japanese invasion up to the 1945 elections. Pero like, we went through what? A world war, resistance movements, and sobrang daming changes sa government.
Pero if you think about it, it makes sense naman eh. Like the fact that war brings out the worst in people, it brings out a whole lot of selfish ambitions and desperations.
Siguro for those who lived through the Japanese occupation, it didn't feel like 4 years eh. Kaya the effects of the war were carried on to so many years that came after. Pero para sa inyo guys, ano ba yung biggest takeaways sa chapters 5 to 7?
Siguro ako muna magsimula. So, just right on top of my head pa lang, dun sa Hook Balahap, kasi sobrang nakakalungkot talaga na they believe in the Americans and they even fought side by side with them. Pero in the end, na-disown lang sila ni MacArthur kasi he saw them as an obstacle. Ang gusto lang naman ng Hooks ay proper representation and reforms for peasants and laborers. They wanted peace and equality, but they got destruction and betrayal in return. Like, sobrang opportunity lost din nun.
True. Sayang talaga mga Hooks kasi ang galing ng military organization nila. At makikita mo rin yung nationalism sa goals nila. Pero imbis na ma-inspire sa kanila yung ibang guerrillas, inaaway lang sila.
Okay, like personally, para sa akin, yung clash ng Yusufe at Hooks kasi nagpakita talaga siya ng class conflicts. You have the Americans and Yusufe leaders from the bourgeoisie while the Hooks are the peasants. Like in the capitalist system that the US wanted to preserve, the rich would always do everything and anything to keep the common folk at check kahit away nila yung kapwang Pilipino, di ba? Old oligarchy kasi hates the concept of equality kasi it means nga less exploitation, less profit, di ba?
Tama. And like, hindi lang naman din talaga Americans yung reasons ng downfall ng mga Hooks. Kasi pati mga Filipinos, part din ng problem. Like, that's so wicked and heartbreaking.
Ano naman thoughts niyo dun kay MacArthur?
Oh my God, ang galing niya talaga strategist in war and politics. The fact na sinasamba siya ng Filipinos as hero shows na ang galing niya talaga as propagandist.
Yes, and dun sa political reformation plans niya, nagmi-meet in the middle siya para masatisfy demands ng elite collaborators and guerrilla leaders. Gini-justify niya rin kuno yung discrimination sa Hooks with legal charges on arson, murder, and robbery from the USFS para hindi mahalata na threaten lang talaga siya sa potential nila.
And yung part na he left Osmeña with the possession of president, knowing na walang-wala na yung Pilipinas that time, it was a smart move kasi it indirectly ruined Osmeña's image. Like, it was so well calculated to make the public like Rojas, which is yung manok ni MacArthur, and hate Osmeña. And people cannot blame him then for that kasi sobrang behind the scenes ng manipulation.
Pero like, para sa inyo, do you consider MacArthur as the hero in the Philippines?
For the oligarchy, yes. Kasi ultimately, sila talaga nag-benefit sa actions ni MacArthur eh.
In the context of war naman siguro, medyo mahirap sabihin na hero siya. Kasi sure, bumalik siya sa Philippines para i-drive out yung Japanese. Pero that was after 3 years of instructing guerrilla units to lay low and gather intelligence lang about the enemy. Pinagbawalan yung mga Filipino to engage in combat against the Japanese. Pero if you think about it, so dami-dami ng guerrilla units sa country, kaya naman nila lumaban. So, bakit pinagbawalan sila ni MacArthur?
Baka kasi he wanted to do it himself, you know.
Exactly. Like, parang gusto niya talaga siya yung mag-head ng operation sa pag-drive out ng Japanese troops para masolidify yung hero image niya post-war, which is yung gusto niya as part of his ulterior motive to make a neo-colony out of the Philippines.
Save the best part daw for him, eme.
Diba? Like, after so many heroic narratives passed on about MacArthur, na-overshadow niya yung great truths, diba?
With all of that we discussed, do you think Philippines really achieved independence after the Commonwealth?
Politically, yes, pero economically, no. Like, you know, we went through so many political revolutions but never a social one. Like, hindi pa tayo nagkakaroon ng anti-colonial consciousness, you know.
Agree ako kay Toni. Just like what MacArthur envisioned kasi, Rojas paved the way for the Americans to control our resources and business circles. Basically, nadala pa rin natin yung American dependence after the Commonwealth.
And sobrang deep-seated na sa atin yung American salvation from the war. Like, it was almost like ayaw na namang Filipinos na maging independent or takot yung Pilipinas na maging independent after centuries of colonization by different countries. Filipinos did not also have that nationalism since mas pinaprioritize nila yung mga self-interest nila.
But in relation naman to like now, Philippine government, there was I mean, may effort naman, di ba, to lessen the dependency on the US, especially during President Duterte's term. Like, he chose naman to sever the ties with the US and try to build relations to countries near, like China and Russia. But honestly, I think that it will take a long time for the US dependency to vanish, like, due to the heroic light we see America in.
Sobrang sad truth nun. And it's even sadder kasi sabi ni Direk, we have to end this program na. So, that's it for chapters 5 to 7 of A Continuing Past. Remember to always drink your coffees kasi sabi nga nila, a cup of coffee a day keeps the stress away. So, this has been Kape't Kasaysayan, where we coast through history together with our cup of coffees. See you next time!